Branko, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So one of the things I led into before we pulled you on was this reference to the story about the DEA being tasked with collecting domestic intelligence about participants in protests supporting the movement for Black Lives. Is there anything about the DEA's history that concerns you hearing about that news?
So much. Obviously, the DEA. We just this week there's been a quote circulating from one of Nixon's advisors. An old quote. Where he kind of talks about the formation of drug policy or anti-drug policy in the United States and the kind of origins of war on drugs, and basically admitting that part of it was a way to sort of go after the African American community without saying that out loud. And of course, that's exactly how it's functioned. Even if that's, we can say there are a lot of well-meaning people who maybe genuinely believe in the DA's mission, but nonetheless, that's certainly how its mission has kind of been embodied through the years. So the fact that they're now sort of being tasked with surveilling Black activists, in some ways, it's a change in its mission more in degree instead of kind. It's now explicit rather than implicit. But even beyond the DEA's historic targeting towards vulnerable communities, and particularly communities of color, there's also the fact that the DEA has, as usual, from the US to different foreign countries that were supposed to be connected to drugs and drug dealing and the like. Of course, we can see how that could be very rife for abuse, and has
especially under this administration.
Oh yeah, for sure, and any administration. One of the things I think is really important to stress that obviously Trump is a man with authoritarian tendencies and instincts. Obviously, he's surrounded himself with people who have these authoritarian tendencies. I think much stronger, actually, even than Trump. However, it's not just Trump, and it's not just the Republicans. It's also, these policies were under Clinton, they were under Obama. There's a very high likelihood they'll be, I would say even not just high likelihood, a certainty that they'll continue under Biden. The DEA surveillance, which was doing for decades, was in many ways the kind of forerunner to the kind of surveillance that we've seen under the NSA and that kind of thing. And it's all tied together as well. The DEA draws on the same bulk data collection that the NSA does. It sort of shares these things. So the fact that the DEA is being set on protesters, obviously nothing to do with drugs, but it is a very alarming thing. And to me, it's kind of an example of the way that these institutions, these authoritarian institutions, which people warned about at the time that they could be eventually abused and turned on the domestic population, that's finally coming home to roost. We're finally seeing that starting to happen. And in the same way that these police murders have awakened us to how important it is to make serious reforms to police departments all over the country, I think it also points to the need to look at these other law enforcement institutions.
Absolutely. And just to expand the frame there, I think you're absolutely right to seize on the need to not limit ourselves to local police departments as we're taking action on the movement's invitation to defund police, right? By extension, when I hear defund the police, I hear defund the police first and the Pentagon next, because it is security as an apparatus and an aim when infected by profit that inevitably goes off the rails. That is the warning that we got from the architect of the military-industrial complex when he went on national television and said in 1961 that this thing I built to beat the Nazis is going to strangle democracy if you, the American people, don't stay knowledgeable and alert. Knowledgeable and alert is the direct quote from Eisenhower's departing address in 1961. And I feel like he called the fence, he pointed to the fence and said, that's where the ball is going. And he was so right in so many different ways. And, one of the particularly disappointing, enraging, illegitimate, unconstitutional, choose your adjective, dimensions of this problem is that as the military-industrial complex has grown metastatic, it has turned its sights on one of the last remaining markets, having exploited markets around the world, which is to say intervened in countries around the world to enable corporate resource extraction. The military-industrial complex of the United States has turned its sights and its fangs on the American people. That's what militarized police represent. That's what the three-letter agency alphabet soup surveillance apparatus represents. It is authoritarianism in no uncertain terms. And to see at least the awareness of it becoming more widespread under this president is something I'm very grateful for. Finally, having spent 10 years working around civil liberties while many self-described liberals couldn't care less, it does feel it's gratifying to see so many people finally coming to understand why our constitutional rights matter so much. And for me, this is a big part of why I'm running for Congress. From your perspective, as we look at, you mentioned corporate Democrats and the centrist wing of the party, how do you explain the continuity of their support for what began as an illegal, secret Bush-Cheney era initiative? What's your analysis of how that became so unfortunately and thoroughly bipartisan?
I would say there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that for a lot of the kind of corporate centrist Democrats that you're mentioning, there is a real fear to take on the military-industrial complex, or to really stand up against it, because they don't want to get tagged as soft on terror. They don't want Republicans running ads against them saying, they canceled this program, or, tied law enforcement's hands in some way, and therefore they're making American lives, putting American lives at risk, and possibly even costing lives. So I think that's part of it. There's this long-standing allergy, really since the 80s, since the Reagan Revolution, to for Democrats to really go on a limb on some of these issues, particularly around national security. I think the other thing is that there was this tremendous energy under the Bush administration that was aimed at pushing back against the growing surveillance state and a lot of the kind of militarism that Bush stood for, and that he was kind of foisting on the American people. And the Democrats, people like Pelosi, of course, it was very popular then to oppose mass surveillance, because it was a way to oppose Bush. It was a way to kind of co-opt this energy, this popular energy, and say, we're with you. Unfortunately, when Obama was elected, that energy kind of sapped away. It was, I think people were so worried about undermining Obama. And I'm not just saying elected Democrats, but I also mean even ordinary rank and file liberal voters. I think, they thought, well, look, let's let him do whatever he does in national security, because at the end of the day, we want him to pass healthcare reform. We want him to pass Wall Street regulatory reform, that kind of thing. So, we'll shut our eyes and forget about it. And also a lot of people embraced it. They said, well, hey, look, this guy, he is this, unlike Bush, this charming, articulate, very intelligent constitutional lawyer. So if he is embracing a lot of the stuff that Bush did, maybe there's a good reason for that. And, ultimately we can trust him because, he's not like Bush. So I think a lot of that, the pressure went off the Democrats to stand against a lot of this stuff. They didn't really feel any need to, because it wasn't going to cost them politically. And I think that's, more or less where it is today. I mean, most of the popular pressure, and for good reason, is, I think, on Democrats on economic policy. And that's good, but I think we also need to broaden our horizons a little more, because at the end of the day, as we're seeing, not just with the DEA, as you mentioned, being used to go after protesters, but also just generally in the response of the police to this mass unrest in the United States. If we want the kind of mass movement that has to happen, not just in the United States, but all over the world, to solve issues like climate change above all, and so much more, there are these really large authoritarian roadblocks in their way, in the form of things of the police and things of the DEA and things like the potentially even the NSA, which can also be ripe for abuse. And so it will be very hard to kind of create this kind of mass movement if all these authoritarian structures are there, potentially waiting in the wings to block them. And we only need to think back to what happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and the way that national security agencies were abused by government and turned on protesters. So I think people should really think about that as well.
And just to fill in some of that history and connect it to now, that when Branko refers to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was an era, and it lasted decades, when the FBI in particular conducted a series of counterintelligence programs. COINTELPRO is the amalgam that refers to all of them. And I'll be honest with you, as a constitutional lawyer, I have been profoundly dismayed at the number of higher educational institutions I've spoken at where none of the students and even the professors remember what that means. And this is a vital era in not very distant US history that has direct relevance to what we are experiencing today with a would-be fascist president, aspiring tyrant, suppressing dissent. During the COINTELPRO era, for the better part of 50 years, the FBI infiltrated for the express purpose of neutralizing domestic social movements, from the mainline movement for civil rights to the Black Power movement, Puerto Rican independence activists, the Native American movement, people protesting the war in Vietnam, people seeking equal rights for women, all of them, even white supremacists, just to complicate the story here. Everybody, basically, if you believed in anything that challenged the dominant narrative in our proud country committed to our First Amendment, one of your central concerns had to be unaccountable, secret, effectively unconstitutional government agents infiltrating your group, not just to monitor and watch, but to interfere and neutralize. And that was the story of any number of groups. A couple pieces here just to riff on. You were talking about how the Bush and Cheney assault on basic core freedoms became embraced by President Obama, and there wasn't the same pressure for him to repudiate those policies once he came into office. And I remember that era very distinctly because I was leading a national civil liberties organization at the precise time that President Obama decided that he was not going to follow through on his campaign rhetoric in that dimension. And I can even locate it to a particular vote. It was right after he came into office, and there was a proposal to close Guantanamo Bay. And Republican members of Congress basically politically intimidated in exactly the dynamic that you were describing, Branko. Democrats on the Hill, including Speaker Pelosi, wanting not to look weak on national security, basically got browbeaten, and they sold President Obama out. As soon as he got to Washington, he lost a vote on closing Guantanamo. And what he learned from that vote was that civil liberties don't sell. And because they're not politically popular, he went in the convenient route. Now, here's where my background as a constitutional lawyer, I would hope, would inform the body politic. The reason that they are in the Constitution is to take them off the political table. They're not supposed to be up for political discussion. They're in the Constitution. They constitute our polity. And we have members of Congress and a president who don't care. We have justices who are outright unrepentant criminals, right? So these words on paper around which our republic has been constructed are becoming increasingly meaningless. And it is precisely to vindicate those principles that I'm at least running for office. In an ideal world, I wouldn't need to run for office because the Constitution would operate, we'd have courts that would enforce it, and our First Amendment rights would be secure. But what I've spent the last 15 years of my life doing is trying just to defend democracy in the face not just of Trump's corruption and Pelosi's complicity, but Obama's drone strikes and deportations and Pelosi's complicity, Bush's wars and Cheney's wars and Pelosi's complicity. This is a pattern, unfortunately, and I'm so glad to see you connect the dots across both the parties, because I think that's a critical theme that many Americans, unfortunately, don't have a chance to grip just because they watch Fox News and MSNBC, so they don't get to hear anything resembling independent facts. I want to draw a loop around one particular figure. We've touched on the failures or weakness or perhaps complicity and co-optation, what have you, of the Democratic Party. Can you discuss any ways in particular that Speaker Pelosi in particular exemplifies or embodies that dynamic, that problem?
I think we've been seeing it really ever since Trump came to power. Nancy Pelosi claims to stand for a whole host of things, including single-payer healthcare. She has said that climate change is an existential threat. These are all nice words, but when it comes down to it, where does she land on these things? She opposes Medicare for all. She has opposed it, even as it shows. Polls have it extremely popular, not just among Democrats, but even Republicans. Under coronavirus, it's only gotten more popular.
Right.
For good reason, because people are suddenly, millions of them are losing their health insurance, employer-provided health insurance, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, this whole idea that if I like my health care, I can keep it, that's not really working out so well anymore.
Just to restate that, tell me if I'm wrong. If I get it right, you're saying that Nancy Pelosi stands right now to the right of a majority of Republicans.
I believe so. I think one of the recent polls, I think, had Republican support around 60% for
Right.
Medicare for all.
Yeah, you're
so,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And it's clearly not the fact that it's an unpopular policy. It's clearly not the fear of political blowback that is pushing her to embrace it, because now we have a perfect moment where you can finally push for these policies that, maybe since the Reagan Revolution might have seemed kind of daunting to pursue. I think the fact is that the Democratic Party gets a lot of money from pharmaceuticals, health insurers, the healthcare industry as a whole, hospitals. I think that is a big part of it. That is, the party has long ago forsaken anything other than just kind of winning by amassing as much money as possible through corporate donations, and they don't want to risk that. Joe Biden, of course, the Democratic candidate, presumptive, is I believe has the most or had the most donations from health insurers and pharmaceuticals. And that's just one example. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has said that the Green New Deal, she called it the Green Dream or whatever, I believe was the phrase that she used. Obviously, this is a measure meant to, it's not just some feel-good measure to make, environmentalists feel good. I mean, we're talking about the future existence of organized human society, potentially. She has said that it's an existential threat, and yet the only serious measure for actually staving it off, Nancy Pelosi says, well, it's so silly and that's not going to happen. I think, part of it, sure, there's some political considerations there too. But again, the party does not want to alienate certain corporate interests because it doesn't want to get into a fight with them. And we could go on and on and on. I mean, Nancy Pelosi obviously is incredibly wealthy herself. She has money invested in a whole lot of ventures through her husband. I'm not sure what her exact investments are as of right now, but she owned a lot of stock in Apple, for example. I believe it was a couple of years ago, and some other tech companies. I mean, we saw the way that with some of the senators earlier this year when we found that they were investing in industries, or divesting rather, in advance of the coronavirus really becoming full blown. We saw how that was kind of impacting their policy decisions and how they govern and everything. And you have to wonder, I mean, I'm not saying that there's a direct link, but I'm sure that at the back of her mind, having these massive investments in whatever industries is in some way coloring Nancy Pelosi's decisions as she decides what she's going to do.
I'd point out two things here.
Sorry, I promise you this is not the not the
CIA. Not the NSA. Thank you, Jeff.
I just want to interrupt because we have a lot of questions coming in that are piling
Oh yeah,
up.
let's get some audience questions in. Thank you, please.
But Branko, I think you might have had a question or two you wanted to ask of Shahid before we move on to the viewers' questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think one that I'm interested in, because this is something that I've tried to, I guess, reason out for myself, and I think there isn't an easy answer. There really isn't for this. Obviously, with coronavirus, there is the intense need to keep people safe, to socially distance, and in some cases isolate, in terms of just making sure that the virus doesn't spread and kill people, overload the health system, all that. At the same time, there's real concerns about civil liberties. How much can the government really tell you in terms of where you can go, what you can do, how much it can track you? So I'm curious what you think, or if you've given thought, and where you would put that balance between civil liberties and the pandemic response, which obviously in the US, this is going to be an issue that goes on and on and on because of the Trump administration's just awful bungling of this pandemic.
Yeah, there are a bunch of measures we can put in place to make sure that measures that could restrain civil liberties are at least thoughtfully circumscribed, right? And we talk about this in the surveillance context as it relates to national security as examples of why those programs in that context are so problematic. It is precisely because in the national security arena, there are no limits. There's no transparency. There's no meaningful oversight. All of those things, if they were present, would create a very different dynamic. And to whatever extent, for instance, we think that contact tracing or using phone-based apps to facilitate contact tracing makes sense, it's important to make sure that that program is transparent and accountable so that it doesn't become, for instance, another way for the government to track participants in protests, which is exactly what is happening. We know that contact tracing is being weaponized as a domestic intelligence gathering tool. And that's completely illegitimate and unconstitutional and oppressive and un-American, or all too American, depending on how you see that. But in any case, certainly unconstitutional and inconsistent with our commitments to we the American people. In addition to these transparency norms as a general rule, specific parameters that can be adjusted. One of them is use. So we talked just now about making sure the data that's collected for the purpose of protecting public health doesn't get handed off to the domestic, Trump's choose your acronym, whoever's serving as his Gestapo agency. ICE comes to mind, or CBP, or the DEA, or the FBI, or the NSA, or the CIA, or choose your duplicative, wasteful, fraudulent agency. There's another piece here beyond use limits, and that relates to respect for users or people in the collection parameter. So if you're going to use an app to collect information about people's locations or who they speak with or who they come close to, ideally, that's something that people would opt into. Now, there are situations, and historically in our country, incarceration has been one of them, where we've seen fit as a society to basically apply coercive restrictions. I would hope that we don't need to get there. I think a lot of people faced with the public health crisis would very willingly, for instance, self-isolate if the support were there to make that viable. So part of this is not just the coercive measures to keep people, for instance, in their homes if they need to quarantine, but support for people to do that, like canceling rent and mortgage payments to keep people in their homes and diminish the pressure for people to feel like they need to be on the street, putting themselves at risk to do work that in order to feed their families, right? So there are supportive ways for us to respond to the pandemic in addition to these ways that might feel more restrictive. And again, use limits, transparency, and particularly accountability for violations are critical. Again, in the national security context, there's been no accountability for anyone's violations. The CIA right now is led by an unrepentant international criminal, a human rights abuser. And she's never, and Gina Haspel is her name, she's never in any way even apologized for the history of CIA torture in which she was directly complicit. Nancy Pelosi herself is implicated here. She was read into CIA torture in 2006 as the Speaker of the House. And even though her partisan interest as a Democrat, her institutional interest as a leader of Congress, and international law, which requires the disclosure of any evidence, all those interests, the constitutional interest, the institutional interest, the partisan interest, all of them aligned. And what did she do? She carried the Bush administration's water and defended Dick Cheney and swept the evidence under the rug, where it remains still 14 years later. And just, before I, finish kicking the dead horse of the CIA here, which I do hope to make a dead horse at some point if I'm so fortunate to serve in Congress, the agency's also implicated very much in the process that we see around us this week, not necessarily in surveilling protesters as they did during the counterintelligence programs, the COINTELPRO era, but because the CIA running crack cocaine into the US in the 90s is why we have militarized police in the United States. It's why we have mass incarceration. We are responding to a system run amok that has turned its, again, I said this before, its fangs on the American people, but the reason, the pretext, the thing that got the monster out of the cage was US cops being gunned down in US streets by narco traffickers funded, trained, and equipped by the Central Intelligence Agency. And that's not a conspiracy theory, that's documented fact. That was the Iran-Contra scandal. That's what Gary Webb reported. That's the book Dark Alliance. And it's exactly what the Central Intelligence Agency has never paid a price for. And I see us experiencing unfortunate reverberations of our own failures to hold accountable the officials who've abused our rights and the rights of so many other people around the world in the past.
Yeah, and the reality of security agencies so often is so much wilder than any conspiracy theory. If you actually look at the history of them, and I think I just want to add to that as well. We might think about perhaps less invasive ways to track people and to see who they've been in touch with that don't require the kind of invasive technology that we've been hearing about. I know in San Francisco, one of the initiatives has been to take unemployed people and put them to work for the government to actually call people up and sort of trace them in that way. It's still obviously invasive, but it's not to the degree of, tracking your location via cell phone.
Well, similarly, our unhoused community here, we've made available hotel rooms to get people who are at, risk at the elements, compounding their disease vectors, like into spaces where they can be safe. Lots of local initiatives here that we see around the country responding to the pandemic, but I'd love to see if that applies. I want to get in some of these questions from our listeners. Jeff, can you throw us a question?
Question number 2 on line 20. This is from James in Green Bay. I guess your near neighbor to the south. This is for Branko. He said, when asked recently about Donald Trump's protest crackdown, Justin Trudeau paused for an eternity before answering. Any guesses as to what calculations he was making?
I think there are 2 theories behind this. One, I think the one that probably Justin Trudeau wants you to think is that he was really weighing up his response. He really wanted to have a thoughtful answer. He didn't want to just come out with something flippant and rushed, but to really weigh his words carefully and to really kind of stress how outrageous he found this particular thing by taking such long pause. And so it's on the one hand, it's kind of one way to signal that he disapproves without saying it. The other theory that probably Trudeau's detractors would say is that he didn't know what to say and he took a while to think about it. I think it's probably the first one. I think it's he was trying to show the gravity of how outrageous he found Trump's statement. But I think it's also important to note these viral moments, especially with Trudeau, and a lot of kind of liberal leaders around the world that are typically admired on social media, because we sort of see these few little moments here and there that are very symbolically powerful, and we say, wow, if only the United States had lived like that. But it's important not to get hung up and not to overly focus on these symbolic moments and these viral moments that are kind of trying to signify certain things to their audience. There's the same sorts of issues that are plaguing the US are plaguing Canada. They're plaguing my home country of New Zealand too. In fact, an interesting thing, I know the question is about Canada, but I think people will be interested in this as well, is that New Zealand, which has sort of been praised as this kind of liberal example or exemplar for the world, one of the things that was introduced after the horrific Christchurch shooting in 2019 was these armed police response teams, which was a new thing in New Zealand. It's not
like SWAT teams, sort of.
Well, yeah, kind of. I mean, just carrying arms on themselves all the time. We don't have armed police. I mean, police have weapons in New Zealand, but they're not on their person at all times. This is something new. This is very
good reason.
Controversial. Yeah, for a good reason, as we're seeing in the United States. There was a 6-month trial of this, hugely controversial. The data showed that most of the time they were doing traffic stops and not even responding to the most kind of serious cases, because frankly, I mean, violent crime is not that high in New Zealand. It's not as high certainly as it used to be. Long story short, these armed response teams were disbanded, and they were done so not after a lot of criticism, but in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and these massive protests we saw across the United States, and this huge shift in the way that we talk about and think about policing that's been happening over the last 2 weeks. And that bled over to New Zealand. I'm sure it's had different effects in other countries as well that have similar problems. So I think it's important to note that, other countries that aren't run by Trump, they have done outrageous things and they will do outrageous things. And I think it's also important to note that how the conversation is happening in the United States is really influential all across the world. And it's the same in Canada. People in Canada have started talking about police shootings. I mean, people talking about it for a long time, but I think that the issue has gotten even renewed scrutiny and attention because of what's been happening in the States.
U.S. Is there a parakeet where you're at? I should ask what pet you have.
I think it's a particularly loud seagull.
Got
That
it. Okay.
for whatever reason
Right,
they are really out in force right now.
nature reclaims. I'm
Can
glad
I
to
hit
see
you
that
with
they're
another
birds where you're
question?
at. Say that again, Jeff.
Can I hit you with another question? Line 29. RY Pat Macrock on YouTube asked, is it possible to effectively trust bust or break up the military industrial complex and utilize the Defense Production Act when needed?
That's a thoughtful question.
I mean, I'll say I don't know. I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not sure if you can trust bust the military. I assume that that would just be for the private sector. But I mean, I don't think you need to use anything of that sort. Really, I mean, you could go after certainly weapons manufacturers and the like. That would be one way to go about it.
That's it.
But I mean, at the same time, I mean, the fact is that the executive branch and Congress has a tremendous amount of power over what the military does. And it's the fact that the U.S. military and the U.S. surveillance state is as bloated as it is, it's a political choice. It's not a matter of not having the resources to do it. It's a matter of not having the political will. So again, the way to change that is, the same sorts of mass protests we're seeing now against police misconduct. That is a great start, but it has to get much bigger. The targets have to be a lot more ambitious. Obviously, that will come if and when wins come with police reforms. But as I mentioned before, it's not just the police that are a potential authoritarian kind of roadblock to change. There's a whole heap of other potentially even bigger things when we look at the DEA and the NSA and the FBI that are in serious need of not just reform, but possibly something even more radical. So having that mass pressure to push politicians to do what has to be done, that is the key.
Couldn't agree more, though. I do want to complicate the picture just a little bit. I agree with you certainly that Congress has a great deal of influence and it hasn't been using it. Where you mentioned that it's not a lack of resources, but a lack of will, I would actually say that it's both. And the reason that the resources have become a constraint is particularly because of Nancy Pelosi. As the speaker, Nancy Pelosi has defunded $100 million from the legislative branch over the course of her tenure, which is to say Congress has a lot less investigative capacity than it used to. At the moment, she unilaterally imposes a set of House rules that entirely deny to every member of Congress, except for a handful of her deputies, any access to staff with security clearance who can see behind the wall of executive classification to see, have there been CIA coups in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Brazil in the last year? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. And the reason why we don't know is because Speaker Pelosi ensures that members of Congress don't know either. And I do see that as a constitutional infidelity, complicating the sort of disturbing deference to authoritarianism that we're talking about. I do think we need to move on. So I just want to thank you, Branko, for joining us and for all your journalism, for your time today and your insights. You've been a great guest. Good luck with all your work. I can't wait to read your next piece.
Oh, well, thanks very much. I wish you luck too in your race.